We need to disentangle political strength from authoritarian strength and from law breaking. Democrats can say he's consolidating authoritarian power and undertaking illegal acts with the complicity of the Republican Party, but also say that he's a politically diminished and weakened figure. And those two things together create a more combustible and dangerous situation.
Strength is a word and an idea that President Trump talks about constantly. It's not just that he portrays himself as a man willing and able to stand up and take the fight to critics and enemies. It's also that he contrasts his own supposed strength with foes whom he casts as weak and timid. But is all of that true? My guest today says that it's not. Greg Sargent is a staff writer with The New Republic and the host of The New Republic's podcast, The Daily Blast. One of his columns this week is headlined, "Trump is a weak and failing president, and it's time to say so." Greg, welcome to the show. In terms of the big picture, why do you think Trump is not, in fact, strong, but actually weak?
It's important to distinguish between several types of weakness. One type of weakness would refer to how much of the government he controls, how much of his party he controls. By those measures, I think you'd have to say Trump is a somewhat strong figure, particularly the latter piece. The control he wields over the Republican Party and the voting base of the Republican Party is quite firm. But then there's also political weakness, which refers to public opinion, refers to Trump's standing on issues, refers to perceptions of Trump's ability to manage law enforcement. And by that second set of metrics, Trump is a very weak figure. And this gets lost in the discussion because people confuse the consolidation of autocratic power, which is something Trump is very much doing, with political strength. And that's a conflation Trump wants to encourage. And I'm trying to get people to try and disentangle those things.
And to that point, we'll come to the authoritarian tendencies in a few moments. But in terms of the specifics where you see political weakness, one of the issues you mentioned is tariffs and, of course, the intertwined issue of trade more generally, where you see his policies there as, I think, pretty unpopular and therefore politically as political vulnerabilities for him.
Oh, yes. The tariffs are, I think, widely seen by the American public as a failure. That shows up in public poll after public poll. But it's also worth asking what that tells voters, or what voters take from that in terms of perceptions of Trump's leadership abilities. And to that point, I reported on some polling done by the Democratic Senate Majority PAC, which oversees Senate races for the party, which probed that very question. And it found only the high 30s percentage-wise see Trump's tariffs as a sign that he is a strong leader who's trying to do right by America with his strength, whereas a majority of likely 2026 voters sees the tariffs as a sign that Trump is a reckless figure. And I think the reckless idea is important because it really implies that voters see somebody who's out of control, not really master of events, not really at all firm in his leadership abilities. And I should say, by the way, that Trump himself portrays the tariffs again as a sign of his strength. He constantly runs the tariffs through that strong versus weak frame. He says weak and feckless leaders in the past failed to protect America from global competition. I'm going to step in and prevent other countries from ripping us off. It's the whole thing's a fantasy, but the point is he structures the presentation of this issue as one that reflects on his strength, and we're now seeing that voters don't see it that way.
I think also it's perhaps worth mentioning, because perhaps some of our more conservative-minded viewers will be saying, well, a poll from the Senate majority pack aligned with the Democrats is going to find that. But those findings, it's worth pointing out, are broadly consistent with independent polls also on the tariff and trade
Absolutely.
issues.
The public polls are really quite clear on this. Large majorities reject the tariffs, and importantly, large majorities see the tariffs as something that will cause prices to go high. And I think, again, it's worth running that through the strong versus weak frame, because inflation, I believe, is sort of a proxy for a sense that things are not being managed, that they're out of control, that the chief executive is asleep at the switch, he can't manage the economy. Again, Trump himself encourages that frame very much. He constantly defines his economy as very strong. He constantly uses the word strongly to define what he's doing, almost to the point where it seems like a bit of a non sequitur, but he very, very consciously, I think, regularly repeats that word.
And he also does the same, of course, in international affairs more broadly. He
Absolutely.
has asserted that Vladimir Putin would never have invaded Ukraine if Trump was president, that the Hamas attack on Israel wouldn't have happened, etc., etc. But one of the points that you raise in your column is, well, specifically the war in Ukraine and Vladimir Putin, and the fact that for all Trump's assertions of strength, Putin has, well, critics would say played him. Putin seems pretty unconcerned, I think, about Trump's purported suggestions that he's going to put pressure on to end the war in Ukraine, right?
Well, absolutely. I'd like to make a point about how Trump presents his relationship with Putin as well. Keep in mind, folks, that he regularly describes his predecessors as so weak that they essentially gave Ukraine to Putin. This is a phrase Trump uses all the time to describe both Barack Obama and Joe Biden. They gave away parts of Ukraine to Russia. Trump would never have done that. Putin would have never dared to invade Ukraine if Trump had been president. Again, the frame is always strong versus weak. There's a relentless quality to the way he uses that frame. And yes, to your other question, a lot of international relations experts have described Trump as humiliated by Putin on this issue. And I think Trump himself grasps this, because remember, there was a period a few weeks back where he was quite angry with Putin. He was publicly angry with Putin. And if you looked at what he was saying during that period, he was very much preoccupied with the fact that Putin wasn't doing his bidding, wasn't listening to him, translation, making him look weak. So he understands that perception.
In relation to the situation here back at home, I want to circle back to a point we did allude to earlier, which is the authoritarian leanings on the part of President Trump, which I think there's abundant evidence, to my mind, of those leanings. His supporters would argue otherwise, but it's certainly a criticism that one hears from liberals and people concerned about the protection of democracy, that he is constantly expanding the power of the presidency, engaged in power grabs of various kinds. And often when critics make that charge, they literally use the term strongman, comparing him to other figures on the international scene. But as I understand it, you don't see an inconsistency between your belief that he is fundamentally a weak leader and these more strongman, quote unquote, tendencies, right?
Yes, I'd like to make a point about what you said earlier in this question about the tariffs and about authoritarian bent of his presidency. It's worth seeing the tariffs as a fairly large abuse of power. They were just struck down. Many of the tariffs were struck down by an appeals court, which concluded that he was abusing his power and breaking the law by imposing the tariffs. He's not authorized to impose such sweeping tariffs. That's something that Congress is supposed to do. And to your conservative listeners, I want to point out that the people who are bringing these lawsuits against Donald Trump against these tariffs are conservatives and libertarians, many of them. So I don't see why being conservative would reflexively require one to defend these tariffs. for the longest time, we understood conservatism. Now, I'm being a little, I'm not sure it should be understood this way, but it was often characterized as small government, as hostile to major interventions in the economy, et cetera, et cetera. Look, the conservative lawyers who are now going after this describe Trump's tariffs as a massive abuse of power and a betrayal of conservative values. So I would think your conservative listeners would maybe pay attention to those lawyers. They're major figures in the conservative movement.
Mm-hmm.
And to your other question, I'm sorry, Niall. To your other question, I don't think there's a contradiction between amassing autocratic power and being politically weak. Like I said, you could argue that Trump is strong in the sense that he wields great mastery over the Republican Party and can get it to basically support whatever he tells them to. But that doesn't mean he's not politically weakened. I would think, look, many Republican pollsters have been warning that Republicans are in trouble in the midterms as well. And so they don't say it outright, but they would not be saying that if Trump's approval rating were higher.
Sure. And to the party political element of this, Greg, as a final question, we have become, I think, so accustomed to this framing of the strong versus weak thing and Trump claiming strength on his own behalf. I'm not sure that argument by the Democratic Party has been terribly well rebutted thus far. Do you think Democrats and other Trump critics are capable of making that charge stick, of changing the framing around Trump and the purported perception of strength?
Well, I will tell you, I don't know the answer to that, but I think they should absolutely try. I think Democrats are somewhat reluctant to take the road I'm taking here because in some sense they believe it would detract from the argument that he's consolidating authoritarian and autocratic power. And I understand that argument, but again, we need to disentangle political strength versus weakness from autocratic / authoritarian strength versus weakness and from law breaking. Democrats should be out there saying that Trump is politically weak on his major issues. He's underwater on even immigration enforcement, which is constantly described as his strongest issue. He's underwater on every major issue, deeply underwater on the tariffs, underwater on deportations, underwater on the economy. Democrats can say he's consolidating authoritarian power and undertaking illegal acts with the complicity of the Republican Party, but also say that he's a politically diminished and weakened figure. And if anything, those two things together create a more combustible and dangerous situation, in my view. And that's something I think Democrats could say. I don't know if they will, though.
Greg Sargent, a staff writer with the New Republic and host of the New Republic's podcast, The Daily Blast. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you.